Hi, everybody. Welcome to another in the Step Up Your Safety series. Today, we are celebrating, or at least recognizing, May as Heat Stress Awareness Month. And as such, we'll be talking about some tips for keeping you and your employees safe for the summer. I'm Kelly Marshall, and I'll be the host for today's session. Just a couple of things as we get started. You've all entered the webinar on mute. However, if you do have any questions, we will take a look at those at the end. You can enter those using the Q&A function, and we will answer any of those at the end of the session today. So as I mentioned, May is Heat Stress Awareness Month, and in 2022 alone, nearly 2,000 people died of heat-related illnesses. And on average, around 40 people die each year in a work-related heat incident. So we're going to talk today about some of the risks of heat stress, be able to identify the signs and symptoms of a heat-related illness, and most importantly, talk about some practical strategies that you can use and share with your employees to stay cool as the summer months approach. So really, let's start by talking about what the big deal is here. As we start to look at how heat and increased heat can affect our bodies, we know some of these things. We know that our body temperature starts to rise. As that happens, those natural cooling mechanisms that we're used to relying on start to become less efficient. So as that starts to happen, that can put an increased strain on our cardiovascular system. Our heart has to just start to work a little bit harder to try to circulate the blood that helps to try to cool our bodies, which then, of course, leads to an increased heart rate and a risk for additional cardiovascular issues as we start to put some strain on that system. That can then lead to brain dysfunction, things as simple as brain fog and dizziness, but can also be more significant, including compromises to the blood-brain barrier, which can allow some of those harmful substances to start to sneak over that barrier and into the brain, which can lead to inflammation and even cell death. As those systems start to get taxed and overworked, we can also see an increased strain on some of our other significant and important organs like our kidney and liver. And the body's attempt to try to cool itself can start to strain those other organs, which can then lead to additional organ damage. And of course, we can have even more symptoms and side effects as a result, including things like heat cramps, headaches, fainting, and even as significant as death has occurred. So before we talk about some of the risk factors, I wanted to see how familiar we all are with some of these things that we're going to talk about, including the heat index. So if you can see your screens, I just launched a quick question for you to ask about the heat index where you live today, and if you know what that is. If you don't, we'll talk about it, so you'll learn more as we go. Those of you who haven't been able to get to your screen quick enough, I will leave the question open here for just a minute or so as we continue. It looks like most of you are actually pretty familiar, which is awesome. So in addition to the heat index, which we'll talk about, we have some other risk factors to consider when we talk about the exposure to heat stress and heat-related illness and injury. So certainly we know that a high temperature and humidity, which, spoiler alert, is what leads us to that heat index, where we combine the air temperature and the relative humidity for the day, can be a risk factor. It looks like most of you have probably had a chance to answer, and anything above 82 degrees Fahrenheit, for those of you who don't know this index quite as well, is considered to be extreme caution. That's when we combine the relative humidity with the temperature of the day. So I think when I looked earlier, we were verging right on about 81 or 82 degrees, which is what kicks you up into that next level beyond just the the temperature where you are at. So we also know that direct sun exposure can be a risk factor. We feel that, we know that one. We also need to think about some of those indoor radiant heat sources. So while we're talking primarily about outdoor heat today, we can also risk that heat exposure any time of the year when you are exposed to some of those indoor radiant heat sources. So these are things like boilers, water heaters, maybe some different HVAC types of equipment, and those areas which sometimes go together where you might have some limited air movement. As far as the additional outdoor factors, we can also look at the lack of acclimatization. So what they tell us is that it takes anywhere from 7 to 14 days for our bodies to be able to acclimate to that hot weather. And the unfortunate or perhaps fortunate part here is that as those temperatures slide up and down, we may get a few warm days where we start to acclimate a bit, and then we get a cooler day and we've essentially gone backwards and we lose some of that acclimation that we may have already gained. So unfortunately, it takes a solid streak of a week or so for our bodies to start to really acclimate to those warmer temperatures. Dehydration, not drinking enough fluids, can also certainly lead to heat-related illness. We know that physical exertion can be one of those factors as well, along with some of the personal protective equipment, PPE, and clothing that people may be wearing as well. So when we combine those things with physical exertion, a high outdoor temperature, and some of those conditions that they may be working in, you might really add up quickly the risk factors that come into play here. Certain medications and certain physical health conditions can also present an increased risk. It becomes more difficult for people on those medications to be able to regulate their temperature and to be able to sweat and therefore cool down. So certain things that you may not always think about, medications like diuretics, some antidepressants, antihistamines, blood pressure medications, and even some ADHD medications can be an increased risk for people to experience heat-related illnesses. Advanced age in pregnancy can also be physical conditions that cause someone to have a greater exposure to and a risk for a heat-related illness. And of course, anytime that someone's already experienced a prior heat-related illness, they're just at an increased risk to experience something like that again. Certainly, there are industries that may be more susceptible as well. So whether it combines some of these factors, like I mentioned, construction comes to mind, especially those who might be working outside during some of those warmer parts of the day in the direct sun exposure, and occasionally wearing PPE on top of all of those things. They have an increased risk factor for developing or having some sort of a heat-related illness as well. They tell us that the hottest part of the day is actually after 3 p.m., which doesn't always seem to be the case, but really it's that later time in the day when the sun is the highest, when we're getting the most direct sun exposure, that cause the additional risk factors to occur. So what are some of the signs and symptoms? We'll look at an infographic shortly, but in a nutshell, these are some of those. Things like dizziness, muscle cramps, thirst, especially extreme thirst, heavy sweating, that cool, clammy, sometimes white or cold looking skin, nausea and vomiting, headaches, weakness, and just general confusion can be signs that someone is starting to experience the effects of a hot environment. I really like this picture because it defines very well the difference between both heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see the lesser of the two conditions here, where we're in that heat exhaustion category. This is where maybe somebody's starting to feel a little bit faint or dizzy. They may be sweating excessively. You start to see that cool, the pale, clammy skin, maybe a little bit of nausea or vomiting. They generally have a rapid but weak pulse, and they may start to experience some muscle cramps. The fortunate part here is this is when we still have the opportunity to intervene. So when we're seeing someone with these sorts of symptoms, you can simply help to get them to a cooler environment, maybe in some air conditioning, using some of those cooling towels, Make sure that they're drinking water, trying to get their body cooled down, maybe a cold compress or a cold shower if those are things that are possible. And you may still be able to avoid crossing over into the red side here, where we approach the more dangerous of the two conditions, which is that heat stroke. When we've reached the red side of this depiction, then we start to see those symptoms and the severity of them increase. This is where somebody might be experiencing a very significant or a throbbing headache. They've actually now stopped sweating because their body has lost that ability to regulate itself and to cool itself down. Typically, you start to see body temps that range above 103 degrees at this point, and their skin may actually have become red and hot and dry, and they have a rapid but now a strong pulse. This is the point at which they may also have crossed over from simply that faintness or dizziness and actually lose consciousness. At this point, we've lost our opportunity to intervene, and instead, this is really an emergent situation. So if you see or know someone who's experiencing these symptoms, then that's really the time to call 911 and to take immediate action to get that person the help they need and to get them and their body temperature cooled down. I like this infographic, so if you're interested, you can check out the weather.gov site and take a look at this one if it's something that you would find helpful as well. So we've talked a little bit about signs and symptoms, and now we'll talk about what we should do to try to prevent those things. So we know a lot of these things, and I think we've made a lot of progress as well. Some of those are pretty obvious, right? So when we can, it's most appropriate to wear loose and lightweight clothing. There's been a lot of progress made lately in some of those higher visibility opportunities where we have the UPF or some of the lighter colored clothing that fits the bill for meeting all of those things while still keeping employees visible and safe. Keeping employees hydrated and also making sure that they are aware of being able to take breaks, to get into a shady spot when that's available throughout the day, to avoid working in the heat of the day whenever that's possible, including maybe even shifting your normal work hours just a little bit earlier into the day so that you can get done before that 3 o'clock hour hits and you're really working in the heat of the day. It's important with that hydration piece as well to make sure that you're getting some balance with electrolytes. So things like Gatorade and salty drinks can help, including things like some of the high water content foods that maybe we don't always think about, that all of that hydration doesn't have to come simply from trying to take in a lot of water or sports drinks. Things like watermelon and grapes could be very helpful as well to get some of that water built back up in your system and to try to keep yourself hydrated. I mentioned cooling towels. Those can be helpful, especially on those really hot days. If you can combine that with a break in the shade, even better. There are also some really neat heat stress indicator signs. So something similar that you could use would be maybe in a vehicle, for example, that when the heat index has crossed over into some of those more dangerous thresholds, the sign will actually turn red, which then is a really good visible reminder that we need to be paying attention and that we need to recognize that that heat might start to be a concern fairly soon. For those of you who don't know or who answered not sure on the heat index question, the National Weather Service, and with so many weather apps at our fingertips these days, provides really good information. The heat index is now part of the forecast. And so if that's something that is applicable to you, or if you have a teenage daughter in your house, you're probably pretty well aware on a daily basis of what the UV index is. So heat index is another important factor to make sure that everybody's aware of as you're starting to approach some of these hotter environments, hotter months coming up. A couple of things that I wanted to make sure to point out before we look at any questions. A couple of neat things I think you'll find interesting. So we will be sending out a survey at the conclusion of this webinar. A couple of questions. If you have any input about what you'd like to see in future webinar events, that's always very helpful. But also you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording for today's webinar and a reminder about where to find a few resources, including some posters that mention some good heat stress tips. But what's new this month is that all of these recorded sessions are now available on both our website at rascompanies.com and also on our YouTube page. And so you can not only look at any previously recorded webinars here, but you can go to that page to sign up for any upcoming webinars and direct any others that may be interested to that location as well, so that they don't miss out on any of that important and timely safety information that's coming up. So next month, we'll be talking about fixing safety culture and what safety culture looks like in your organization. If you aren't already, not only should you be subscribed to RAS Corporate Communications to make sure you're getting emails about upcoming webinars, but you can follow our LinkedIn page that will always make sure that you're aware of what's coming up as well. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop those in the Q&A at this point. And if not, I wish you all a wonderful summer, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.